The crisis of a society never begins in its laws. It begins in the human heart. Long before modern psychology tried to map the inner life, one thinker confronted a more uncomfortable truth. A broken world is not repaired by systems. It is repaired by character. The real question is not how to redesign institutions. The real question is far more demanding. What kind of human being must exist for a society to remain humane? More than 2,000 years ago, in an age of political collapse and moral confusion, Confucius faced this question directly. The world around him was losing its ethical center. Power replaced virtue. Ritual lost meaning. Words no longer matched reality. Where many sought new laws or stronger rulers, Confucius looked somewhere deeper and far more difficult. He looked at the human being. His answer was radical in its simplicity. If the human heart is disordered, society will inevitably decay. If the human heart is cultivated, order begins to grow naturally. For Confucius, philosophy was never an abstract system of ideas. It was a demanding art of living, a discipline of shaping one's character until one's presence itself becomes a source of harmony. But this raises a disturbing question for us today. In an age of technology, speed, and constant noise, have we become better at organizing the world while forgetting how to organize ourselves? Before we continue, you are gently invited to subscribe, leave a like, and share a comment. This channel is a small space for grounding and reflection, created for those who seek a calmer way of understanding themselves and the world. If you feel comfortable, tell us where you are and what time it is for you. Your presence here matters, and your words help weave a quiet community across the distance. May what follows bring you ease, clarity, and a softer place to rest your thoughts. To understand the depth of this question, we must begin with the very heart of Confucian philosophy. The idea that everything begins with one quiet but demanding task. The lifelong cultivation of the human being. Human goodness is not a decoration of life. It is the hidden structure that allows human life to exist at all. Most people believe morality is a rule imposed from outside, a system, a command, a list of behaviors society forces upon individuals so that chaos does not erupt. Confucius stripped that illusion away long before modern psychology began asking the same question. He argued something far more unsettling. Moral life does not begin with law. It begins with the human heart. And that heart has a name in his philosophy: Ren. Before political theories, before institutional religion, before modern ethical systems tried to explain human behavior, Confucius looked directly at the core of human existence and asked a brutal question. What makes a human truly human? Not biologically, not socially, but morally. His answer was radical for his time. The essence of being human is the capacity to care for another person. Ren is not a doctrine. It is not a ritual. It is not a rule book. Ren is the inner force that makes compassion possible. It is the quiet but demanding awareness that another person's suffering is not separate from our own. When Ren is alive, the boundary between self and other becomes morally unstable. Confucius saw this long before the language of psychology existed. While the world around him was collapsing into political rivalry, corruption, and social fragmentation, he did not begin by designing new laws. He began with the individual human heart. Because he understood a truth that societies repeatedly forget. When the heart collapses, institutions cannot save civilization. Ren is the foundation of everything that follows in his philosophy. But here lies the deeper challenge. Ren is not an abstract goodness floating inside the soul. It only exists in relationship. A person alone on an island cannot practice Ren. Humanity reveals itself only when one human being encounters another. This insight cuts directly into a common misunderstanding. Many people believe goodness is a private trait, like intelligence or talent, something a person possesses internally. Confucius rejected this view. Humanity is relational. It appears in how we treat the people standing in front of us. A gentle word to a stranger, patience with a difficult colleague, loyalty to a friend, respect toward parents. These moments are not minor gestures. They are the arena where Ren either lives or dies. The heart of Confucian ethics, therefore, does not begin with grand heroic acts. It begins with ordinary human encounters. Because every encounter poses a silent moral question. Will you recognize the humanity of the other person, or will you reduce them to a tool for your own interest? Ren demands the first answer. Confucius understood that this demand is not easy. Humans naturally drift towards self-interest. Fear narrows perception. Pride blinds judgment. Ambition turns other people into obstacles or instruments. Under pressure, the instinct to protect the self often overrides the instinct to care. Ren, therefore, is not a natural state we automatically maintain. It is a discipline, a lifelong cultivation. Confucius often compared moral development to the slow shaping of character through repeated practice. Compassion is not sustained by emotion alone. It must be trained through awareness, restraint, and reflection. Each day, a person must ask a difficult question. Did I treat others as fully human today? If the answer is no, Ren demands correction. If the answer is yes, Ren demands consistency. The path is endless. This is where Confucius becomes psychologically profound. He does not assume humans are naturally virtuous in a stable way. Instead, he believes the seed of humanity exists within everyone, but that seed must be cultivated continuously or it withers. Modern life often hides this truth. In a technologically advanced world, people imagine moral progress is guaranteed by education, systems, and regulations. Yet emotional indifference still spreads quietly through modern societies. People communicate instantly across continents while remaining incapable of genuine empathy for those closest to them. Confucius would not be surprised, because technology does not strengthen the heart. It merely amplifies whatever already exists within it. A person without Ren simply gains more efficient ways to pursue self-interest. This is why Confucius insisted that moral cultivation must be constant and personal. No institution can perform this work for us. Schools may transmit knowledge, governments may enforce order, but the awakening of humanity inside a person remains an individual responsibility. And this responsibility never ends. Ren is not something achieved once and permanently secured. It must be renewed every day. Each interaction either strengthens or weakens it. A moment of patience nourishes it. a moment of cruelty erodes it. Over years, these moments accumulate until a person's character becomes visible in everything they do. Confucius believed that truly humane individuals transform the moral atmosphere around them. Their presence encourages trust. Their actions reduce hostility. Their consistency inspires imitation. Without announcing themselves, they become quiet centers of ethical gravity. This is why he valued the figure of the morally cultivated person so deeply. Not because such a person seeks recognition, but because their humanity radiates outward into the social world. Through one person practicing Ren, relationships become more humane. Through many people practicing Ren, society itself begins to heal. But here is the uncomfortable truth that Confucius forces us to confront. Most people prefer comfort over moral effort. Compassion requires attention. Attention requires time, and time demands sacrifice. It is easier to remain indifferent than to remain humane. Ren therefore exposes something painful about human psychology. We often know the right response, yet we hesitate to perform it. We see suffering, yet we rationalize distance. We recognize injustice, yet we remain silent. Confucius never romanticized humanity. He knew that the greatest obstacle to Ren is not ignorance, but avoidance. People fear the emotional cost of caring. To truly recognize another person's humanity means accepting responsibility for how we affect their life. Responsibility is heavy. Ren demands that weight. Consider a simple moment. A person speaks harshly in anger. The immediate instinct of the listener is retaliation. Pride pushes back. Ego demands defense. Yet Ren interrupts this reaction. It asks a quieter question. What pain produced those words? This pause is the birth of humanity. Ren does not mean passive submission to wrongdoing. It means refusing to let anger define the entire relationship. It insists on seeing the deeper complexity within the other person. In this way, Ren acts as a psychological discipline that expands moral perception. Instead of reacting impulsively, the humane person observes, reflects, and responds with awareness. Confucius believed this capacity separates mere survival from genuine humanity. A human life measured only by success, wealth, or status remains morally incomplete. Without Ren, achievement becomes hollow, influence becomes dangerous, power becomes destructive. History repeatedly confirms this lesson. Societies collapse not only because of external enemies, but because empathy disappears from their internal structure. When people stop recognizing one another as fully human, exploitation becomes normal, distrust spreads, institutions decay from within. Confucius watched this process unfold in his own era. Political leaders pursued power while neglecting moral responsibility. Rituals became empty performances rather than expressions of respect. Language itself lost sincerity. Amid this decay, he returned again and again to the same fundamental insight. If humanity disappears from the heart of individuals, no social system can compensate for its absence. Ren must come first. Only then can order, justice, and harmony emerge. And yet Ren alone does not sustain society. Human compassion must find form. Emotion must translate into behavior. Inner intention must express itself through visible actions that structure everyday life. Without that structure, even sincere humanity becomes unstable. Good intentions fade. Discipline weakens. The heart forgets what it once knew. So the question slowly rises from the foundation Confucius has laid. If Ren is the living heart of morality, what shape allows that heart to survive within the chaos of human interaction? What kind of practices can train compassion so that it does not disappear under pressure? Confucius answers this question not by looking inward again, but by turning toward the patterns of behavior that organize human relationships. Through those patterns, he begins to reveal the second pillar of his philosophy, the framework that transforms inner humanity into visible order in everyday life. Human compassion cannot survive as a vague feeling. It must take shape in action, or it slowly dissolves into sentiment. Confucius understood this with ruthless clarity. Ren may awaken the heart, but the heart alone cannot organize society. Emotion is unstable. Intention fades. Even sincere goodness becomes unreliable when it is left without structure. A person may feel compassion in the morning and forget it by evening. A society built only on emotion cannot endure. This is where the second pillar of Confucian philosophy emerges with quiet authority. The living heart of humanity must be guided by form, and that form has a name: Li. Most modern readers misunderstand Li the moment they hear the word ritual. They imagine rigid ceremonies, formal gestures, empty traditions preserved by habit. Confucius meant something far deeper. Li is not superficial etiquette. It is the architecture of human interaction. Long before sociology or behavioral psychology tried to explain how social order emerges, Confucius had already recognized a powerful truth. The way people behave outwardly gradually shapes who they become inwardly. Action precedes character. This idea challenges a popular modern belief. Many people assume authentic morality must come purely from the inside. If a gesture is practiced intentionally, it is considered artificial. If respect is trained, it is dismissed as performance. Confucius rejected this assumption entirely. He believed that disciplined behavior trains the heart. A child does not automatically understand respect. They learn it through repeated gestures. Greeting elders, listening without interruption, speaking with restraint. These acts begin as imitation, but through repetition, they slowly transform the inner structure of the person. The external movement reshapes the internal world. Li therefore operates as a psychological training ground. It guides individuals through patterns of behavior that gradually cultivate moral awareness. Every gesture, every tone of voice, every small interaction becomes an opportunity to reinforce the presence of Ren. Without Li, compassion remains fragile. With Li, compassion becomes habit. Confucius observed that societies collapse not simply because people become cruel, but because they become careless. The erosion begins quietly. Politeness disappears. Gratitude fades. Language becomes harsh. Small acts of respect are abandoned because they seem unnecessary. People assume these details do not matter. Confucius insisted they matter more than anything else. Because civilization is sustained by countless small gestures that affirm human dignity. A respectful greeting, a moment of patience, a measured response in conflict. These behaviors create an atmosphere in which trust can grow. When they vanish, distrust spreads like a slow infection. Li protects these invisible threads of social life. It teaches individuals that every encounter carries moral weight. When a person bows slightly to another, the gesture does more than signal politeness. It reminds the individual that the other person possesses dignity. When someone speaks carefully rather than aggressively, they reinforce a discipline that restrains impulsive hostility. Through these repeated acts, the emotional climate of a community is gradually shaped. Confucius saw this long before modern civilization accelerated human interaction to unprecedented speed. In the world of 2025, communication travels instantly across screens and networks. Yet the structure of respect has weakened in many places. Words are thrown carelessly. Reactions are immediate. Thoughtful restraint is replaced by impulsive expression. Technology amplifies human voice, but rarely trains human character. Confucius would recognize the danger immediately, because Li slows human behavior. It forces the individual to pause before acting. It demands awareness of context. It reminds the person that every action occurs within a network of relationships. This pause is not weakness. It is moral intelligence. Without it, emotion becomes reckless. With it, emotion becomes disciplined. Li therefore serves as a bridge between the internal and external dimensions of human life. Ren gives birth to compassion. Li gives compassion form. But the relationship between the two is delicate. Ritual without humanity becomes empty performance. Humanity without ritual becomes unstable emotion. Confucius insisted that both must exist together, each correcting the excess of the other. A person who performs rituals without sincerity becomes rigid and hypocritical. A person who relies only on feelings becomes unpredictable and inconsistent. True moral cultivation requires the union of inner intention and outer discipline. This insight reveals something profound about human psychology. People do not simply think their way into ethical character. They train their way into it. Repeated actions gradually carve pathways within the mind. Habits shape perception. Patterns of behavior reshape emotional response. Li operates within this mechanism. Every respectful action reinforces awareness of others. Every disciplined response strengthens emotional control. Over time, these actions accumulate until the individual's character becomes stable. Confucius believed that when Li is properly practiced, it transforms social space into a field of mutual recognition. People become aware of their roles within relationships. Friend understands friend. Child understands parent. Leader understands responsibility. Each role carries expectations that guide behavior. These expectations do not imprison individuals, they orient them. In a world without shared behavioral norms, people drift through interactions without clarity. Misunderstanding multiplies. Conflict escalates quickly because individuals lack the habits that regulate response. Li provides those habits. Consider a simple moment of disagreement. Without ritual discipline, argument easily becomes aggression. Voices rise. Ego dominates. The conflict escalates until the relationship fractures. But when Li is present, the structure of interaction imposes restraint. Each person listens before responding. language remains measured. Even disagreement occurs within boundaries of respect. The conflict may remain, but hostility does not consume the participants. This is not mere politeness. It is a moral technology. Confucius understood that civilization depends on the ability to maintain dignity, even in disagreement. Li protects that dignity. At a deeper psychological level, Li performs another critical function. It reminds individuals that they are not isolated beings. Every action exists within a network of consequences that extend beyond the self. When someone practices ritual respect toward a parent, they reinforce gratitude. When they show loyalty to a friend, they strengthen trust. When they treat strangers with courtesy, they affirm shared humanity. Through thousands of these gestures, the moral fabric of society becomes visible. Yet, Confucius was not naive. He knew rituals can decay. Over time, people begin performing them mechanically. The original spirit disappears while the gestures remain. This is the moment when Li loses its power. Ritual becomes theater. Respect becomes choreography. When this happens, the structure remains, but the heart has vanished. Confucius warned repeatedly against this danger. The purpose of Li is not to display moral superiority. Its purpose is to cultivate genuine awareness of others. If the inner spirit disappears, the ritual must be renewed or abandoned. Because without Ren, Li becomes empty, and without Li, Ren becomes directionless. The balance between them requires constant vigilance. Here lies the quiet discipline Confucius demanded from every individual. Each gesture must remain connected to its moral purpose. Each act of respect must be conscious rather than automatic. Ritual should train awareness, not replace it. When practiced with sincerity, Li does something remarkable. It stabilizes human relationships. People begin to trust that others will behave predictably and respectfully. This trust reduces fear. Reduced fear opens the space for cooperation. Cooperation allows communities to flourish. In this sense, Li does not simply organize behavior. It shapes the emotional atmosphere of society. Confucius believed that when Li disappears, anxiety rises. People no longer know what to expect from each other. Suspicion replaces confidence. Every interaction becomes uncertain. Modern life often reveals this instability. Social norms shift rapidly. Expectations become ambiguous. Individuals navigate relationships without clear behavioral guidance. The result is not greater freedom, but greater confusion. Confucius would argue that freedom without moral structure quickly becomes social chaos. Li provides a structure that allows freedom to coexist with harmony. But even this structure requires a living example to sustain it. Rituals alone cannot inspire people to pursue moral cultivation. Individuals need to see what a fully developed human character looks like in practice. They need a living embodiment of Ren, guided by Li. A person whose inner humanity and outward discipline merge into a stable moral presence. Confucius called such a person by a specific name, a figure who stands at the center of his ethical vision and represents the highest form of cultivated humanity. A society cannot survive on abstract virtues alone. It requires living examples of what a fully formed human being looks like. Confucius understood that principles do not transform the world by themselves. Words about compassion, respect, and discipline remain powerless unless they are embodied by real individuals whose lives make those principles visible. People rarely change because of argument. They change because they witness character. For this reason, Confucius placed at the center of his philosophy a specific human ideal. Not a saint, not a ruler, not a divine figure, a cultivated human being. He called this person the Junzi. The word is often translated as noble person, but the meaning is far more radical than the translation suggests. In the ancient world where Confucius lived, nobility was determined by birth. Power flowed through bloodlines. Social status defined moral authority. A person was considered superior not because of character, but because of ancestry. Confucius shattered this assumption. He redefined nobility as an achievement of the soul rather than a privilege of birth. A Junzi is not born, a Junzi is built. This idea carried enormous philosophical force. It meant that moral greatness was open to anyone willing to undertake the discipline of self-cultivation. The son of a farmer could surpass the son of a king if his character was stronger. Authority would no longer be measured by status, but by integrity. In a rigid hierarchical society, this claim was quietly revolutionary. Confucius did not call for violent social change. He did something more dangerous. He changed the standard by which human worth was judged. The Junzi stands as the living synthesis of the two forces already described. Ren provides the inner humanity. Li provides the disciplined form of behavior. But the Junzi represents their full integration within a stable character. This integration does not appear suddenly. It is the result of relentless inner work. Confucius believed the first task of the Junzi is self-examination, not occasional reflection, continuous moral scrutiny. Each day, the individual must confront uncomfortable questions. Did I act from sincerity or from vanity? Did I respect others or merely pretend to? Did my actions strengthen trust or weaken it? This process strips away illusion. Most people prefer to protect their self-image. They justify their behavior. They blame circumstances. They defend their pride. The Junzi refuses this comfort. He confronts himself without mercy. This ruthless honesty is the foundation of moral stability. Without it, the individual drifts between impulses, adapting character to convenience. Today generous, tomorrow selfish. Today respectful, tomorrow arrogant. Character becomes situational rather than principled. The Junzi rejects such instability. His behavior remains consistent across changing circumstances. Whether speaking to a ruler or a servant, he maintains the same fundamental respects. Whether experiencing success or failure, he preserves the same moral orientation. External events may shift around him, but the internal axis of his character remains steady. This steadiness is not natural. It must be trained. Confucius often described the Junzi as someone who disciplines desire rather than being ruled by it. Human impulses are powerful. Pride seeks recognition. Anger demands retaliation. Greed pushes toward advantage. Fear encourages silence in the face of injustice. These impulses exist within everyone. What distinguishes the Junzi is not the absence of such impulses, but the ability to regulate them. He observes them rising within himself and then chooses his response carefully. He refuses to allow temporary emotions to determine permanent actions. In this sense, the Junzi practices a form of psychological mastery long before the language of modern psychology existed. He understands that the greatest battlefield lies inside the human mind. Victory in this battle produces a remarkable result. The Junzi becomes trustworthy. Trust is not built through declarations. It emerges through consistent behavior over time. When people observe that an individual acts with integrity, regardless of circumstance, confidence grows naturally. Others begin to rely on his judgment. They seek his advice. They measure their own conduct against his example. Influence appears without coercion. This is precisely the form of leadership Confucius valued. He believed moral authority is stronger than political authority. A ruler may command obedience through fear, but such obedience disappears the moment force weakens. A Junzi inspires voluntary respect. People follow him because they recognize the authenticity of his character. This distinction reveals something profound about human nature. Fear controls behavior temporarily. Respect transforms behavior permanently. The Junzi operates through the second force. But this role carries a heavy burden. The Junzi cannot afford moral laziness. Because others watch him, his smallest actions carry symbolic weight. A careless word may damage trust. A selfish decision may weaken the example he represents. Confucius therefore insisted that the Junzi must cultivate humility alongside discipline. Humility prevents arrogance from corrupting character. A person who believes himself morally superior soon becomes blind to his own flaws. Pride destroys the self-examination that originally shaped his growth. The Junzi remembers that cultivation is never complete. Every day presents new tests. This humility also shapes how the Junzi treats others. He does not despise those who struggle morally. Instead, he recognizes that every person stands somewhere along the path of development. Some have advanced further, others remain near the beginning, but all possess the potential for transformation. The Junzi therefore leads not through condemnation, but through example. When someone behaves selfishly, he does not respond with hostility. He demonstrates an alternative. When someone speaks harshly, he answers calmly. When someone acts dishonestly, he maintains integrity. These responses do more than resolve individual conflicts. They reveal a different way of being human. Confucius believed such examples possess quiet, persuasive power. People may resist lectures, but they find it difficult to ignore visible character. Over time, the presence of the Junzi begins to influence the moral environment around him. Others gradually adjust their own behavior. The process is subtle but profound. This is why Confucius placed such emphasis on personal cultivation rather than institutional reform. Laws can restrain wrongdoing, but they cannot inspire virtue. Only living character can do that. And yet Confucius also recognized a disturbing reality. Most people pursue status rather than character. Ambition drives them toward wealth, recognition, and influence. They measure success by external markers. Titles, possessions, and social position become substitutes for genuine moral achievement. Confucius warned that this pursuit leads to a dangerous illusion. A person may appear powerful while remaining internally weak. Without disciplined character, authority becomes unstable. The individual becomes vulnerable to temptation and fear. When crisis arrives, such people reveal their fragility. The Junzi stands in direct contrast to this pattern. He measures success not by public admiration, but by internal alignment with moral principles. If he must choose between advantage and integrity, he chooses integrity. If he must choose between popularity and honesty, he chooses honesty. These choices often carry cost. Confucius never pretended the path of the Junzi was comfortable. In a world where ambition dominates, principled individuals may appear naive or impractical. They may lose opportunities. They may face criticism or isolation. But Confucius insisted that this sacrifice reveals the true weight of character. Because moral courage appears only when something valuable is at risk. The Junzi accepts this risk willingly. He understands that integrity cannot exist without the possibility of loss. To preserve character, he may have to endure misunderstanding, resistance, or even failure. Yet, through this endurance, he gains something more durable than success. He gains moral freedom. A person who refuses to compromise fundamental values cannot be manipulated easily. Threats lose their power. Temptations lose their appeal. External pressures no longer determine internal direction. The Junzi becomes internally sovereign. This sovereignty explains why Confucius saw such individuals as the foundation of a stable society. When leaders possess this level of character, their authority becomes trustworthy. When teachers embody it, education gains moral depth. When parents practice it, children absorb discipline naturally. Character spreads through example. But this vision also reveals a deeper tension within human society. If moral authority depends on character rather than status, then society must learn how to recognize genuine virtue. Titles alone cannot guarantee it. Power alone cannot create it. Confucius realized that this recognition requires something extremely delicate: clarity. People must be able to distinguish appearance from reality. They must understand what words truly mean. They must recognize when language reflects truth and when it disguises it. Because when language itself becomes distorted, society loses the ability to identify genuine character. A dishonest leader may still be called honorable. A selfish person may still be praised as generous. Titles remain while meaning disappears. And once words detach from reality, the entire moral structure of society begins to collapse. When language loses its connection to truth, morality collapses silently. Confucius saw this danger long before political propaganda, digital media, or ideological manipulation reshaped human communication. He understood that society does not decay only through violence or corruption. Sometimes it decays through words, slowly, quietly, almost invisibly. A dishonest word repeated often enough begins to feel normal. A distorted meaning gradually replaces the original truth. Over time, people stop noticing the difference between what something is and what it is called. Confucius identified this process with surgical clarity. He called the solution the rectification of names. This idea may appear simple at first glance. Words must correspond to reality. Titles must reflect genuine behavior. Language must describe the world accurately. But beneath this simplicity lies one of the most penetrating psychological insights in ancient philosophy. Human beings live inside language. Our understanding of reality is filtered through the words we use to describe it. When those words become corrupted, our perception becomes corrupted as well. We begin to misrecognize the world around us. Confucius saw that moral chaos often begins precisely at this point. When rulers behave selfishly, yet still claim the title of virtuous leaders, language has already fractured. When loyalty is demanded but not practiced, the word loyalty becomes hollow. When respect is expected but never demonstrated, the meaning of respect dissolves. The collapse does not occur in a single dramatic moment. It spreads gradually, like a fog, thickening over the landscape of human understanding. Eventually, people no longer know what anything truly means. Confucius insisted that once this confusion reaches a certain depth, society becomes impossible to govern morally. Because if words lose their connection to reality, accountability disappears. No one can judge behavior accurately when the language used to describe that behavior has been manipulated. Truth becomes negotiable. Power begins to define meaning. This insight places language at the center of ethical life. Words are not merely tools of communication. They are instruments of moral orientation. Through language, we identify roles, responsibilities, and expectations. Through language, we distinguish honesty from deception, justice from exploitation, leadership from domination. When language becomes unclear, these distinctions blur. Confucius therefore demanded something radical for his time. Every name must correspond to the actual nature of the thing it describes. A ruler must behave as a ruler should. A father must fulfill the responsibilities of a father. A friend must honor the obligations of friendship. If the behavior does not match the title becomes false. This principle seems obvious, yet human societies repeatedly violate it. People often cling to prestigious labels while abandoning the responsibilities those labels require. Someone may hold authority without wisdom. Another may demand respect without offering it. Institutions may preserve honorable names long after their original purpose has faded. Confucius refused to tolerate this gap between word and reality. For him, the rectification of names was not an abstract linguistic exercise. It was a moral correction, a method of restoring clarity to the structure of society. When names become accurate again, responsibilities become visible again. Once responsibilities become visible, people can evaluate behavior honestly. And once behavior can be judged honestly, moral accountability returns. Confucius believed this process must begin with leadership. If those who hold authority misuse language, the entire social order becomes distorted. Subordinates imitate the same behavior. Words become tools of manipulation rather than instruments of truth. Soon, every conversation becomes strategic. Trust disappears. Confucius warned that such a society may continue functioning externally, but internally it is already collapsing. People obey outwardly while privately losing respect for the institutions around them. This erosion is extremely dangerous because once trust vanishes, authority must increasingly rely on force rather than legitimacy. Fear replaces respect. Control replaces cooperation. The system survives only through pressure. Confucius believed the rectification of names prevents this degeneration. It forces leaders to confront a simple but uncomfortable standard. If you claim the title of leader, your actions must justify that claim. If you call yourself just, your decisions must demonstrate justice. If you present yourself as a guardian of order, your behavior must embody discipline. Otherwise, the name must change, or the person must change. This demand reveals something profound about human psychology. People often fear losing status more than they fear losing integrity. Titles provide identity. They grant recognition. They create a sense of importance. When that identity is threatened, individuals instinctively defend it, even if their behavior contradicts the title they hold. Confucius disrupted this psychological defense. He insisted that titles are not personal possessions. They are moral responsibilities. If the responsibility disappears, the title becomes empty noise. This insight remains unsettling even in the world of 2025. Modern societies still struggle with the same problem Confucius observed centuries ago. Words circulate endlessly through media, politics, and institutions. Yet, many of those words no longer carry stable meaning. Integrity becomes a slogan rather than a practice. Leadership becomes branding rather than character. Public language grows louder while private trust grows weaker. Confucius would recognize the pattern immediately because he understood that language shapes moral perception. When dishonest language dominates public discourse, individuals gradually lose their ability to distinguish authenticity from performance. The mind becomes confused. Confusion breeds cynicism, and cynicism slowly destroys the belief that genuine virtue even exists. Confucius refused to accept this outcome. The rectification of names serves as a defense against moral cynicism. It restores the connection between words and reality. It reminds people that language still possesses ethical weight. A promise must mean something. A title must mean something. A commitment must mean something. Without that weight, social life becomes a theater of appearances. But the rectification of names requires courage. Speaking truth about language often exposes uncomfortable realities. It forces individuals to acknowledge when respected figures fail their responsibilities. It reveals when institutions drift away from their original purpose. Many people prefer to avoid this confrontation. Silence feels safer. Confucius rejected silence. He believed moral clarity demands honest speech, not aggressive accusation, but precise language that refuses to disguise reality. The Junzi, the cultivated person, practices this discipline carefully. He chooses words that correspond to truth rather than convenience. Through this precision, he protects the moral structure of communication. Yet, Confucius also understood that correct language alone cannot transform society. Words may reveal truth, but individuals must still learn how to recognize that truth within themselves. Clarity of language opens the door to moral awareness, but it does not automatically produce it. People must be trained to perceive meaning accurately. They must learn to question appearances, examine assumptions, and refine their understanding of human life. Without this intellectual discipline, even correct language becomes ineffective. Words may carry truth, but listeners may lack the ability to interpret them. Confucius therefore turned toward another essential dimension of human development: education. Not education as the accumulation of information, but education as the slow shaping of perception, judgment, and character. Only through sustained learning can individuals acquire the intellectual and moral clarity necessary to preserve the connection between words and reality. Because if human beings do not learn how to think carefully, they will inevitably return to the same confusion that language once created. Knowledge without moral transformation is only decoration of the mind. Confucius recognized a danger that still haunts modern education. People accumulate information, memorize theories, and master technical skills, yet their character remains unchanged. Intelligence expands while wisdom remains shallow. The mind grows sharp while the heart grows indifferent. For Confucius, this imbalance was not merely a personal flaw, it was a civilizational threat, because knowledge divorced from morality becomes a tool of manipulation. This is why Confucius approached learning with unusual seriousness. Education, in his vision, was never about intellectual prestige. It was about becoming a better human being. Learning existed for one purpose only: the transformation of character. Before modern universities, before academic specialization divided knowledge into countless disciplines, Confucius proposed a radically unified vision of education. Knowledge must refine the soul. If it does not, it fails its purpose. This claim challenges a deeply rooted modern assumption. Many people believe education is primarily about competence. It prepares individuals for careers. It increases productivity. It equips society with skilled professionals. Confucius saw something deeper. Competence without moral orientation can damage the world more efficiently. A clever mind without discipline becomes dangerous. A knowledgeable person without integrity can justify almost anything. For this reason, Confucius insisted that learning must be tied directly to ethical self-cultivation. Every piece of knowledge should sharpen moral awareness rather than inflate intellectual pride. Learning begins with humility. The student must first recognize ignorance, not as an insult, but as the natural starting point of understanding. Confucius admired those who asked questions openly. Curiosity signaled intellectual honesty. Pretending to know what one does not know was, in his view, a serious moral error, because deception directed toward others eventually becomes deception directed toward oneself. The learner who protects pride cannot grow. The learner who admits uncertainty begins to expand. Confucius therefore praised the discipline of inquiry. He believed questions reveal the vitality of the mind. A student who questions actively participates in the search for truth rather than passively receiving information. But questioning alone is not enough. Learning must be accompanied by reflection. Confucius famously warned that learning without reflection leads to confusion, while reflection without learning leads to danger. These two forces must operate together. Knowledge provides material for thought. Reflection transforms that material into understanding. Without reflection, knowledge remains scattered. Facts accumulate but fail to connect. The learner becomes overloaded with information, yet unable to interpret its significance. Reflection organizes knowledge around moral insight. It asks how new understanding should influence behavior. It asks what responsibility accompanies each discovery. This movement from information to responsibility is the heart of Confucian education. Consider a simple historical example. A student studies the rise and fall of ancient states. Without reflection, this knowledge remains a collection of events, dates, names, victories, and defeats. But reflection introduces a deeper question. Why did these societies collapse? What human weaknesses produced their downfall? Pride, corruption, greed, neglect of responsibility. Suddenly, history becomes a mirror. The learner begins to recognize the same tendencies within himself. Education becomes moral confrontation. Confucius believed this confrontation was essential. True learning does not flatter the ego. It exposes its limitations. It forces the individual to face uncomfortable truths about human nature. But this discomfort serves a purpose. It motivates self-correction. A person who studies moral philosophy without applying it to personal behavior misses the entire point of the discipline. Confucius would consider such a person merely literate, not educated. Education must penetrate conduct. The learner reads about loyalty and then examines his own loyalty. He studies justice and then questions his own fairness. He reflects on responsibility and then evaluates his own actions. This process gradually reshapes character. Learning becomes a tool for inner refinement. Confucius also emphasized that this process never ends. Education is not confined to youth. It is a lifelong discipline. Human understanding evolves through experience. Each stage of life presents new challenges that require deeper wisdom. A young person studies principles. An adult tests those principles in real situations. An older person reflects on the outcomes of those tests. Through this continuous cycle, knowledge deepens into wisdom. Confucius himself often described learning as a source of profound joy. Not the superficial pleasure of entertainment, but the quiet satisfaction of intellectual and moral growth. When a person discovers new insight, the mind expands. When that insight leads to improved conduct, the heart stabilizes. Learning nourishes both intellect and character simultaneously. This harmony explains why Confucius placed such importance on teachers. A true teacher does more than transmit information. He models the integration of knowledge and virtue. Students observe not only what he says, but how he lives. His conduct becomes a living lesson. Through this example, students begin to understand that learning is not merely cognitive, it is existential. Knowledge shapes identity. Confucius also rejected the idea that education should be reserved for elites. In his time, social class often determined access to learning. Noble families received instruction, while ordinary people remained excluded. Confucius broke this pattern. He accepted students from many backgrounds, believing that the capacity for moral growth existed in every person. Intelligence and discipline mattered more than wealth or status. This openness reinforced his earlier belief about the Junzi. Great character is not inherited, it is cultivated. Education becomes the pathway through which individuals transform potential into reality. Yet Confucius remained cautious about the dangers that accompany learning. Knowledge can inflate arrogance if the learner becomes obsessed with superiority. Intellectual achievement may tempt individuals to look down upon others. This arrogance destroys the purpose of education. True learning should produce humility, not pride. Because the more a person understands the complexity of life, the more aware he becomes of his own limitations. Confucius admired students who remained modest even as their knowledge expanded. Such individuals remained receptive to further insight. They recognized that wisdom grows slowly through patient effort. Arrogance closes the mind. Humility keeps it open. In the world of 2025, this lesson carries urgent relevance. Information now travels at extraordinary speed. Anyone can access vast libraries of knowledge through digital networks. Yet access to information does not guarantee wisdom. People often confuse familiarity with understanding. They read quickly but reflect rarely. They repeat opinions without examining their foundations. The result is a culture rich in data but poor in discernment. Confucius would argue that true learning requires slowness. Time must be given for reflection. Ideas must be tested against experience. Knowledge must reshape conduct before it becomes genuine wisdom. Without this transformation, education becomes accumulation rather than cultivation. Confucius envisioned something very different. He imagined a society in which learning continuously refined the moral awareness of its citizens. Individuals would grow wiser with age. Communities would benefit from the insight of those who had dedicated decades to study and reflection. Knowledge would serve humanity rather than dominate it. But even this vision of education does not exist in isolation. Learning shapes individuals. Yet, individuals are not isolated beings. Every person emerges from a network of relationships that begins long before formal education starts. The earliest lessons of life do not occur in classrooms. They occur in the family. Before a child learns philosophy, before they encounter teachers or texts, they observe the behavior of parents. They absorb patterns of care, respect, authority, and responsibility within the intimate space of home. Confucius understood that these early relationships leave a permanent imprint on moral development. And so, the path of cultivation inevitably turns toward the first community every human being experiences, the place where the foundations of character are quietly formed long before the mind begins to study them consciously. The first moral universe a human being encounters is not the state, not the school, and not the law. It is the family. Confucius understood that long before modern psychology began studying early childhood development. He recognized that the deepest patterns of human behavior are formed in the most intimate relationships of life. Before a person learns philosophy, before they study ethics, before they even understand the language of moral reasoning, they experience something far more powerful. They experience how love, authority, and responsibility function inside the home. For Confucius, this experience becomes the root of moral character, and the principle that governs it has a name that stands at the center of his social philosophy: filial devotion. Filial devotion is often misunderstood as simple obedience to parents. Such a narrow interpretation strips away its psychological depth. Confucius meant something far more demanding. Filial devotion is the recognition that one's life emerges from another life, and that this origin carries a permanent moral responsibility. Every human being enters the world completely helpless. Survival depends entirely on the care of others. A child cannot feed itself, protect itself, or understand the dangers surrounding it. Without parental dedication, the child would simply perish. Confucius believed this fundamental dependence should never be forgotten. Gratitude becomes the first moral emotion. From that gratitude grows respect. From respect grows responsibility. Filial devotion, therefore, is not blind submission. It is an awareness of the invisible debt that binds generations together. Parents invest years of labor, patience, and sacrifice into raising a child. The child, upon reaching maturity, must recognize that effort and respond with care and reverence. This recognition forms the first lesson in moral reciprocity. Before a person learns to treat strangers ethically, they must learn to treat their parents with dignity. Confucius saw this family relationship as the training ground of all social virtues. Compassion is first experienced through parental care. Respect is first practiced through obedience and attentiveness. Responsibility appears through participation in family duties. Inside the home, the child observes patterns of behavior that silently shape the structure of the mind. If parents treat each other with respect, the child absorbs that pattern. If parents demonstrate patience, the child learns emotional restraint. If parents practice integrity, the child begins to recognize the value of honesty. These early impressions form the psychological foundation of character. Confucius did not believe morality emerges suddenly through intellectual reflection. He believed it grows slowly through lived relationships. The family becomes the first environment where Ren takes visible form. A child who experiences genuine care begins to understand what caring means. A child who receives patience learns how patience feels. A child who witnesses loyalty begins to recognize loyalty as a human possibility. Without these experiences, moral concepts remain abstract. This is why Confucius considered the health of the family essential to the stability of society. A nation cannot produce humane citizens if its households fail to cultivate humane relationships. The connection is direct. Disorder inside families eventually appears as disorder inside institutions. When respect disappears between parents and children, the language of authority loses meaning. When gratitude fades, selfishness grows. When responsibility weakens, individuals become detached from the welfare of others. The family acts as the first school of moral orientation. Confucius therefore insisted that filial devotion is not limited to childhood. It continues throughout life. Even as adults gain independence, they remain connected to those who gave them life. Caring for aging parents becomes a continuation of the same moral bond that began in infancy. This care reflects a profound philosophical insight. Human life is not a sequence of isolated individuals. It is a chain of generations. Each generation inherits existence from the previous one and passes it forward to the next. Filial devotion preserves the memory of this continuity. It reminds individuals that they are not self-created beings, but participants in an ongoing human story. Modern culture often celebrates radical independence. The ideal individual appears self-sufficient, detached from obligations that limit personal freedom. Confucius would regard this image with skepticism, because absolute independence is an illusion. Every human life depends on countless acts of support from others. Recognizing this dependence does not diminish dignity, it deepens it. Filial devotion trains individuals to see themselves within a network of relationships, rather than as isolated units pursuing private success. But Confucius also warned that filial devotion requires balance. Respect toward parents does not mean moral blindness. If a parent acts unjustly, the child must respond with gentle correction rather than silent approval. True devotion includes honesty. A son who sees his father making a harmful decision must speak carefully but sincerely. Silence in the face of wrongdoing does not protect the parent. It abandons them to their error. Confucius believed genuine respect includes the courage to guide loved ones back toward moral clarity. This insight reveals the ethical maturity of his philosophy. Filial devotion is not passive submission. It is an active commitment to the moral well-being of the family. The relationship flows in both directions. Parents care for children. Children honor parents. Both share responsibility for preserving harmony within the household. When this balance functions properly, the family becomes a powerful source of psychological stability. Individuals raised within such an environment develop emotional security. They learn trust. They learn patience. They learn how conflicts can be resolved without destroying relationships. These lessons extend outward into society. A person who understands family loyalty will approach friendships differently. A person who practices respect at home will carry that habit into public life. The patterns learned in early relationships quietly guide interactions with colleagues, neighbors, and leaders. Confucius saw society as an expansion of the family structure. The same virtues that sustain harmony inside the home must eventually govern larger communities. Respect between parent and child becomes respect between ruler and citizen. Care between siblings becomes solidarity among friends. Responsibility within the household becomes responsibility within the state. This progression reveals the architectural logic of Confucian ethics. Human development begins with the individual heart through Ren. It gains behavioral structure through Li. It finds personal embodiment in the cultivated character of the Junzi. It gains clarity through truthful language. It deepens through lifelong learning. And it first becomes visible within the intimate bonds of the family. But once these bonds are established, another question inevitably emerges. If moral character begins in the household, how should it extend into the broader structures of society? How should leaders govern communities composed of individuals shaped by these private relationships. Confucius believed that the principles cultivated in the family should not disappear when individuals enter political life. On the contrary, they should guide it. Because the stability of a nation ultimately depends on the moral character of those who govern it. Power without moral character destroys the society it claims to lead. Confucius confronted this truth while living in an era where political authority had largely abandoned ethical responsibility. Rulers competed for dominance. Officials pursued personal advantage. Titles of leadership remained in place, but the moral substance that should justify those titles had begun to disappear. Confucius looked at this landscape and asked a devastating question. What gives a ruler the right to govern other human beings? Not military force, not inherited status, not wealth. None of these, in his view, created legitimate authority. They only created the appearance of power. Real authority emerges from moral character. This conviction stands at the heart of Confucius's political philosophy. Governance, he argued, must begin with the inner cultivation of the leader. A disordered character cannot produce an ordered society. The logic behind this claim is brutally simple. Human beings imitate what they see. If those at the top of society behave selfishly, the behavior spreads downward. Officials mirror the ambition of rulers. Citizens mirror the conduct of officials. Corruption flows through the system like water through open channels. But if leaders embody discipline, fairness, and responsibility, a different pattern emerges. Subordinates begin to adjust their own behavior to match the moral tone set above them. Confucius believed moral influence travels through society the way gravity shapes the movement of physical objects, invisible but undeniable. For this reason, he rejected the idea that harsh laws and punishments could produce a stable society. Fear can control behavior temporarily, but it cannot cultivate virtue. When fear disappears, wrongdoing returns. Fear regulates actions. Example transforms character. Confucius therefore argued that the ruler must first become a moral model, not through speeches or declarations, but through visible conduct. The leader must demonstrate integrity in decisions, restraint in power, humility in success, and responsibility in failure. These qualities create trust. Trust is the most powerful political force a society can possess. When citizens trust their leaders, cooperation becomes natural. People obey laws not merely because they fear punishment, but because they believe the system serves a moral purpose. Stability emerges from voluntary alignment rather than forced submission. But when trust disappears, governance becomes fragile. Leaders must increasingly rely on surveillance, coercion, and manipulation to maintain control. The system may appear stable from the outside, but internally it is under constant tension. Confucius saw this instability clearly in his own time. Many rulers demanded loyalty while demonstrating none. They issued commands but neglected responsibility. They enjoyed privileges while ignoring the suffering of their people. In such conditions, political authority loses its legitimacy. Confucius did not propose rebellion as the solution. Instead, he proposed something more demanding. Leaders must transform themselves. The first task of governance is self-governance. A ruler who cannot discipline his own desires cannot expect discipline from others. A leader who lies cannot cultivate honesty in his officials. A person who seeks luxury while citizens struggle cannot inspire public virtue. Character flows downward. Confucius illustrated this principle through a simple image. The moral character of the ruler is like the wind. The character of the people is like grass. When the wind blows, the grass bends. The direction of leadership shapes the direction of society. But this image also carries a warning. If the wind itself becomes chaotic, the grass will bend chaotically as well. Disorder at the top multiplies disorder below. Confucius believed this responsibility places enormous weight on those who hold power. Leadership is not privilege, it is burden. Every decision carries consequences that extend far beyond the individual making it. A careless policy can damage thousands of lives. A corrupt official can erode public trust across an entire region. A leader's moral weakness can destabilize the moral confidence of an entire nation. For this reason, Confucius insisted that leaders must cultivate the same virtues expected of the Junzi: self-discipline, humility, sincerity, commitment to justice. These qualities do not merely make a ruler admirable, they make governance possible. Without them, authority becomes fragile theater. Confucius also recognized that moral governance does not eliminate the need for laws. Rules remain necessary to coordinate complex societies. But he insisted that laws should function as a secondary mechanism rather than the primary one. The deeper order of society must come from character. When citizens internalize moral discipline, fewer external controls are required. People regulate their own behavior because they understand its consequences for others. This is the ideal Confucius imagined: a society where ethical awareness flows from leaders to citizens, from institutions to households, creating a network of mutual responsibility. But Confucius was not naive about the difficulty of achieving such a society. Power attracts ambition. Ambition attracts individuals who seek advantage rather than responsibility. This tension has existed in every political system throughout history. Confucius responded to this tension with a radical expectation. Leaders must be judged not by their promises, but by their conduct. If their actions contradict their words, the contradiction reveals their true character. This demand connects directly to the earlier principle of rectifying names. A ruler must behave as a ruler should. If he fails, the title itself becomes a lie. Confucius believed that when leaders consistently embody virtue, they create a powerful moral atmosphere within society. Citizens begin to feel that ethical behavior matters. Public life becomes a stage where integrity is visible and rewarded. This atmosphere encourages the growth of trust, cooperation, and long-term stability. But when leadership loses its ethical center, a different atmosphere spreads. Cynicism replaces trust. Citizens begin to assume that every decision hides selfish motives. Loyalty disappears because no one believes the system deserves loyalty. Individuals pursue personal survival rather than collective well-being. The society becomes fragmented. Confucius feared this fragmentation deeply. Because once a community loses its belief in moral leadership, restoring that belief becomes extremely difficult. Distrust hardens into habit. Every action by authority is interpreted through suspicion. The damage spreads across generations. For this reason, Confucius insisted that those who govern must constantly examine themselves. They must ask whether their actions strengthen or weaken the moral confidence of the people they lead. This self-examination demands courage. Leaders must be willing to recognize their own errors. They must listen to honest criticism. They must adjust their conduct when it falls short of the standards they claim to uphold. Without this humility, power becomes blind. Yet even the most virtuous ruler does not govern in isolation. Confucius understood that political authority ultimately rests on something deeper than individual character. Beyond human institutions lies a broader moral order that judges the legitimacy of leadership itself. Rulers may command armies and administer laws, but their authority remains fragile if it loses alignment with that greater order. When the moral balance between leadership and responsibility collapses, history shows that power eventually slips away. Confucius described this mysterious relationship between ethical authority and cosmic order with a concept that shaped the political imagination of East Asia for centuries. A concept that asks a final, unsettling question. Where does the right to rule truly come from? Political power is never permanent. It survives only as long as moral legitimacy sustains it. Confucius believed this principle governs the fate of every ruler, every dynasty, and every political system. Leaders may imagine that armies protect their authority, that wealth secures their dominance, or that tradition guarantees their right to rule. Yet history repeatedly strips away these illusions. Kingdoms collapse, dynasties vanish, empires that once seemed eternal dissolve into memory. Confucius looked at this pattern and refused to explain it through accident alone. Beneath the visible movement of history, he saw a deeper moral structure. Authority, he argued, is not owned by rulers. It is entrusted to them. And that trust comes from a source larger than any human institution. He called this source heaven. Modern readers often misinterpret this concept as purely religious. Confucius did not describe heaven as a distant deity issuing arbitrary commands. Instead, he spoke of it as a moral order woven into the fabric of existence itself, a principle that governs the relationship between power and responsibility. Within this order, political authority must align with ethical conduct. When rulers govern with justice, discipline, and compassion, their authority harmonizes with the moral structure of the world. Society flourishes, stability emerges, trust deepens between leaders and citizens. But when rulers abandon virtue, something begins to fracture. The ruler may still hold the throne. The army may still enforce commands. The palace may still project power. Yet beneath these appearances, legitimacy begins to erode. Confucius called this legitimacy the mandate of heaven. It is not a certificate granted once and permanently secured. It is a living relationship between moral conduct and political authority. A ruler receives the mandate only as long as his behavior reflects the ethical responsibilities of leadership. The moment he abandons those responsibilities, the mandate begins to withdraw. This idea carries enormous psychological force. It means that power is never morally neutral. Leadership is constantly being judged, not merely by the people, but by the deeper moral order embedded within human life. A ruler cannot hide behind titles or traditions. His conduct exposes the truth of his authority. Confucius understood that people often struggle to see this process while it is unfolding. During periods of corruption, rulers frequently maintain control through fear or manipulation. Citizens may feel powerless to challenge authority directly. The system appears immovable. Yet Confucius believed the loss of moral legitimacy creates invisible fractures that eventually become impossible to ignore. Public trust weakens. Officials lose discipline. Citizens withdraw loyalty. The moral gravity that once held the society together begins to dissolve. These signs reveal that the mandate is fading. History repeatedly confirms this pattern. Dynasties collapse not simply because of external enemies, but because internal corruption drains their moral strength. When leadership becomes selfish, the bond between ruler and people deteriorates. Eventually, the structure cannot sustain itself. Confucius did not celebrate this collapse. He regarded it as tragic. Because when the mandate disappears, societies often descend into chaos before new leadership emerges. Innocent people suffer while the moral balance of power readjusts. For this reason, Confucius insisted that rulers must guard their moral integrity with extreme vigilance. Power magnifies every weakness. A small personal flaw can produce enormous public consequences. Greed within a ruler becomes economic exploitation across a nation. Arrogance at the top spreads through the bureaucracy beneath it. Indifference towards suffering transforms into widespread injustice. The mandate of heaven, therefore, demands constant self-examination from those who govern. A ruler must ask himself relentlessly whether his decisions serve the well-being of the people. He must question whether ambition is distorting his judgment. He must remain alert to the temptation of power, which quietly persuades individuals that their authority entitles them to privilege rather than responsibility. Confucius believed the ruler who remembers the mandate will remain humble, because he understands that authority is fragile. It depends not on force, but on alignment with a moral order larger than himself. This awareness produces a specific form of leadership. Instead of ruling through intimidation, the leader seeks harmony between personal conduct and public responsibility. He treats power as a tool for protecting the community, rather than a prize to satisfy personal ambition. Such leadership generates trust, and trust, in Confucius's view, becomes the strongest foundation of political stability. Citizens may tolerate hardship if they believe their rulers are sincere. They may endure difficulty if they trust that leadership remains committed to justice. But when that belief disappears, even prosperous societies begin to fracture, because prosperity cannot replace legitimacy. Confucius recognized that this dynamic extends beyond politics. The concept of the mandate reflects a broader philosophical insight. Human life itself unfolds within an ethical structure that transcends individual desire. People often imagine themselves as autonomous agents, free to pursue whatever goals they choose. Yet their actions inevitably interact with the lives of others. Harmful choices ripple outward through families, communities, and institutions. The consequences eventually return. In this sense, the mandate of heaven mirrors the deeper logic of moral causality. Actions aligned with justice strengthen the fabric of society. Actions driven by selfishness weaken it. Confucius believed that wise leaders perceive this relationship clearly. They understand that every policy decision carries moral weight. Governing a nation means shaping the conditions under which millions of lives unfold. Such responsibility demands extraordinary discipline. A ruler must cultivate the virtues described earlier: compassion through Run, behavioral restraint through Li, integrity through the character of the Junzi, clarity through truthful language, wisdom through lifelong learning. Without these foundations, power becomes unstable. But even a morally disciplined ruler faces another challenge. Human beings are not perfectly rational creatures. They struggle with fear, pride, resentment, and misunderstanding. Even when leaders act responsibly, conflicts arise within society. Interests collide. Individuals pursue advantage at the expense of others. The stability of the state, therefore, cannot rely solely on leadership. Citizens themselves must cultivate moral awareness. Confucius believed that the mandate of heaven does not operate only at the level of rulers. It reflects a broader moral expectation placed upon every individual. Each person contributes to the ethical atmosphere of society through daily interactions. A community governed by selfish individuals will struggle to maintain harmony, regardless of who sits on the throne. This insight returns the focus of Confucian philosophy to the individual heart. Political order ultimately rests on the behavior of ordinary people. When citizens treat one another with respect, fairness, and empathy, the entire society becomes more stable. When they pursue only personal gain, collective trust deteriorates. Confucius therefore emphasized a simple but powerful moral principle that every person could practice. A principle capable of transforming everyday relationships. A principle that asks each individual to confront the most difficult ethical question of all. How should I treat another human being when I hold the power to harm them? Moral civilization collapses the moment a person stops recognizing the humanity of another. Confucius understood that laws, rituals, institutions, and even virtuous rulers cannot fully protect society if individuals themselves abandon empathy. A nation may possess wise leaders, it may build strong institutions, it may cultivate traditions that structure behavior, yet beneath all of these structures lies a more fragile foundation. How one human being treats another. Confucius believed the entire architecture of moral life ultimately rests on a single ethical discipline, not a complex theory, not a philosophical system reserved for scholars, a principle simple enough for anyone to practice, but demanding enough to transform a civilization. He called it reciprocity. The principle appears deceptively small. Do not impose on others what you yourself would not accept. Yet inside this brief sentence lies one of the most powerful moral insights in human history. Because reciprocity forces the individual to confront a truth that the human mind instinctively avoids. The other person feels as deeply as you do. Every human being carries an inner world invisible from the outside. Hopes, fears, wounds, desires, and fragile expectations exist within every consciousness. Yet when conflict arises, the mind tends to forget this complexity. The other person becomes reduced to a role, an obstacle, a rival, a stranger. Once this reduction occurs, cruelty becomes easier. Confucius wanted to interrupt this psychological shortcut. Reciprocity forces the individual to pause and reverse perspective. Before acting, a person must ask a disarming question. Would I accept this treatment if our positions were reversed? This question breaks the illusion of moral distance. Suddenly, the other person's vulnerability becomes visible. Reciprocity, therefore, functions as an exercise in moral imagination. It requires the individual to step outside the narrow boundaries of personal interest and enter the emotional space of another human being. This movement is not automatic. Human psychology naturally centers on the self. Pain feels immediate when it belongs to us. Injustice feels intolerable when we suffer it. Yet the same intensity rarely appears when the suffering belongs to someone else. Reciprocity demands that we overcome this asymmetry. Confucius believed that moral maturity begins precisely at the moment when a person recognizes that their own desire for dignity must be extended to others. The discipline seems small, but its consequences are immense. Imagine a conversation between two people in disagreement. Without reciprocity, each side defends its position aggressively. Words sharpen, voices rise. The conversation becomes a contest rather than an attempt at understanding. But when reciprocity enters the interaction, something shifts. One person pauses. He asks himself whether the tone he is using would feel fair if directed toward him. He asks whether the impatience he displays would feel respectful if reversed. This moment of reflection changes behavior. The voice softens. The response becomes measured. Conflict remains, but hostility begins to dissolve. Reciprocity, therefore, acts as a stabilizing force within everyday life. It prevents minor disagreements from escalating into destructive confrontations. It reminds individuals that preserving dignity is more important than winning arguments. Confucius believed this principle should guide not only private relationships, but the entire structure of society. A ruler who practices reciprocity will consider the suffering of the people before issuing commands. An official who follows this discipline will treat citizens with fairness rather than arrogance. A merchant guided by reciprocity will avoid exploiting customers for short-term profit. Even within families, the principle remains powerful. Parents must ask whether the authority they exercise respects the dignity of their children. Children must consider whether their behavior honors the sacrifices of their parents. Reciprocity transforms each relationship into a field of mutual awareness. Through this constant reflection, empathy deepens, and empathy produces restraint. Confucius did not expect human beings to become saints. He knew that anger, jealousy, and ambition remain permanent features of human psychology. Reciprocity does not eliminate these impulses. It regulates them. Before acting on emotion, the individual pauses long enough to consider its impact on others. This pause is the birthplace of ethical behavior. Without it, the mind reacts instantly, driven by impulse. With it, the mind regains control. In this sense, Reciprocity becomes a form of psychological training. It teaches individuals to examine their own motivations with honesty. It forces them to acknowledge the hidden ego behind many actions. Often a person believes they are defending justice when in reality they are defending pride. Reciprocity exposes this confusion. When the individual imagines receiving the same treatment he intends to give, the emotional tone of the action becomes clearer. Is it fair? Is it respectful? Is it humane? These questions sharpen moral perception. Confucius saw reciprocity as the practical expression of run within daily life. Compassion becomes real only when it shapes behavior. Reciprocity converts empathy into concrete decisions. Do not humiliate someone if humiliation would wound you. Do not deceive someone if deception would betray you. Do not exploit someone if exploitation would anger you. These guidelines appear modest, yet if practiced consistently, they reshape the entire moral atmosphere of society. Trust increases. Hostility decreases. Cooperation becomes easier. But Confucius also understood the difficulty of sustaining this discipline. Human beings frequently justify their own actions while judging others harshly. The mind constructs excuses that protect self-interest. We forgive our own impatience, but condemn impatience in others. We defend our own ambition, but criticize ambition when it threatens us. Reciprocity dismantles these double standards. It demands that the same moral rule apply in both directions. This requirement feels uncomfortable because it exposes hypocrisy. Yet Confucius believed moral integrity begins precisely at this point of discomfort. A person who refuses to examine their own behavior cannot develop genuine character. Reciprocity becomes a mirror. It reflects the true motivations behind our actions. In the modern world of 2025, this mirror remains urgently necessary. Technology allows individuals to communicate instantly across vast distances, yet emotional understanding often lags behind this speed. Words are written quickly. Judgments appear immediately. Online interactions frequently strip away the subtle cues that remind us of another person's humanity. The screen becomes a barrier that hides empathy. Confucius would warn that without reciprocity, communication becomes increasingly hostile. People forget that behind every message stands a living mind capable of pain. Reciprocity restores that awareness. It reminds individuals that every action leaves an emotional trace within someone else's life. But Confucius also knew that empathy alone does not always produce moral courage. There are moments when a person clearly understands the harm of an action, yet still chooses advantage over fairness. Fear intervenes. Desire intervenes. Self-preservation intervenes. At such moments, a deeper virtue must emerge, a virtue that goes beyond understanding what is humane, a virtue that demands acting upon that understanding even when the cost becomes personal. Because sometimes the right action requires sacrifice. Sometimes integrity requires standing against pressure. Sometimes justice demands a choice that threatens comfort, reputation, or security. And in those moments, the true weight of moral character finally reveals itself. Knowing what is right is easy. Doing what is right when it costs you something is the true measure of a human being. Confucius never believed that moral life was merely a matter of understanding principles. A person may study virtue for decades, They may recite the language of compassion, justice, and responsibility with great elegance. Yet the decisive moment of ethics arrives not in thought, but in choice. A single choice reveals the weight of a character. Confucius called this decisive force righteousness. Righteousness is not moral knowledge, it is moral courage. It is the willingness to act according to what is just, even when doing so threatens personal comfort, advantage, or safety. In every era, human beings face situations where the easier path conflicts with the correct one. The mind recognizes the difference immediately, yet hesitation appears. Fear whispers. Ambition negotiates. Self-interest begins constructing excuses. Righteousness enters precisely at this moment. It demands that the individual refuse these internal negotiations, not because the person enjoys sacrifice, but because they understand something deeper. Integrity cannot exist without the willingness to endure loss. A person who does good only when it is convenient has not yet chosen virtue. They have chosen comfort. Confucius believed this distinction defines the difference between ordinary character and the fully cultivated human being. Anyone can behave ethically when rewards follow. Anyone can speak about justice when no risk is involved. But righteousness appears only when the situation becomes difficult. When silence would protect you, but truth would expose you. When advantage lies in dishonesty, but honesty threatens your position. When loyalty to conscience collides with pressure from authority. These moments strip away illusions. They reveal what a person truly values. Confucius understood that most people instinctively protect themselves first. Survival, reputation, and security pull the mind toward compromise. This tendency does not make individuals evil, it makes them human. But moral greatness requires overcoming this instinct. The cultivated person does not ignore fear. He feels it clearly, yet he refuses to let fear dictate the final decision. Instead, he asks a question that cuts through every excuse. If I abandon what is right today, what will remain of my character tomorrow? This question reveals the long-term cost of moral compromise. External rewards gained through dishonesty may appear beneficial in the short term. Wealth increases. Influence expands. Reputation may even grow temporarily. But something invisible begins to erode. Self-respect. A person who repeatedly sacrifices integrity for advantage gradually loses trust in themselves. They begin to see their own character as negotiable. Each compromise makes the next one easier. Eventually, the individual no longer recognizes the boundary between right and wrong. Confucius believed righteousness protects that boundary. It preserves the internal compass that guides ethical judgment. Without this compass, intelligence becomes dangerous. A clever mind without moral courage can justify almost anything. History offers countless examples. Brilliant administrators who designed systems of exploitation. Skilled officials who protected corrupt rulers. Talented individuals who remained silent while injustice spread. Their knowledge was impressive. Their courage was absent. Confucius regarded such people as failures of character. The Junzi must embody righteousness, not occasionally, but consistently. This consistency requires constant vigilance. Temptation rarely appears in obvious form. It arrives disguised as practicality, loyalty, or necessity. A leader may justify injustice as political stability. An official may excuse corruption as survival within a flawed system. An individual may rationalize dishonesty as protection of family or career. These justifications feel persuasive because they appeal to legitimate concerns. Yet righteousness demands a deeper examination. Does the action align with justice, or does it merely protect personal advantage? Confucius believed the righteous person refuses to blur this distinction, even when standing alone. This solitude often accompanies moral courage. Individuals who challenge injustice frequently encounter resistance. Others may advise silence. Friends may fear association with controversy. Authorities may threaten consequences. The path of righteousness can become lonely. Confucius never denied this difficulty. Yet he believed that integrity generates a different form of strength. A person who acts according to conscience experiences a form of internal freedom that external approval cannot replace. They no longer depend entirely on the judgments of others. Their self-respect becomes anchored in moral clarity rather than public praise. This independence transforms the individual. External pressures lose their absolute power. Threats may still produce anxiety, but they cannot erase the conviction that doing what is right matters more than avoiding discomfort. Confucius saw this conviction as the highest expression of human dignity, because it proves that character can remain stable even under pressure. Yet righteousness must be guided by wisdom. Courage without reflection can become recklessness. Confucius warned that moral action should emerge from careful understanding rather than impulsive zeal. A person must examine circumstances thoughtfully. They must consider consequences. They must distinguish between genuine justice and personal stubbornness. True righteousness integrates courage with discernment. The righteous person therefore continues the discipline of reflection described earlier. He studies history, observes human behavior, and examines his own motivations carefully. Through this process, he strengthens the ability to recognize when moral courage is required and when restraint is wiser. Confucius believed that individuals who embody righteousness become pillars of stability within society. Their presence reassures others that integrity still exists. In times of moral confusion, such individuals remind communities that principles can survive even when circumstances become difficult. Their influence spreads quietly. A single act of courage can awaken conscience in those who witness it. One person's refusal to participate in injustice can inspire others to reconsider their own choices. Character becomes contagious. But Confucius also understood that righteousness demands patience. Moral victories rarely appear immediately. Those who defend justice may face misunderstanding for years. Some sacrifices may never receive public recognition. The righteous person accepts this uncertainty. Because the ultimate goal of virtue is not applause, it is alignment between action and truth. Confucius believed that when enough individuals cultivate this alignment, society gradually changes. Institutions become more trustworthy. Leadership becomes more accountable. Communities rediscover the value of integrity. Yet this transformation never reaches completion. Every generation inherits the same moral challenge. Each person must decide again whether to pursue convenience or righteousness. The path Confucius described, therefore, does not end with a single act of courage. It becomes a lifelong discipline. Individuals repeatedly return to the same question whenever difficult decisions arise. What kind of human being will I choose to become? Through that question, the entire structure of Confucian philosophy quietly reconnects. Humanity begins with compassion in the heart. It gains form through disciplined behavior. It matures through learning and reflection. It grows within families and spreads through society. It shapes leadership and determines the legitimacy of power. And ultimately, it reveals itself in the moment when a person must decide whether moral truth is worth the cost required to defend it. In that moment, the quiet work of self-cultivation that Confucius described across a lifetime finally converges into a single, irreversible act of choice. A society does not transform when laws multiply. It transforms when human beings change. Confucius built his entire philosophy upon this uncompromising insight. While many thinkers search for new systems of power, new institutions, or new punishments to repair a broken society, he looked somewhere far more uncomfortable. He looked into the human heart. His answer was simple but relentless. If the character of individuals remains corrupted, no structure of authority can produce harmony. Institutions may restrain chaos for a moment, but they cannot create moral life. Only human beings can do that. For this reason, Confucius described life not as a competition for success, but as a lifelong discipline of self-cultivation. The journey begins with Ren, the awakening of humanity within the heart. It continues through Li, where inner intention takes form through disciplined behavior. It matures in the figure of the Junzi, the individual whose character remains stable regardless of circumstance. It demands clarity in language, so that truth is not buried beneath deception. It deepens through learning, where knowledge reshapes the soul rather than feeding pride. From there, the path extends outward. Within the family, filial devotion becomes the first school of responsibility. Inside the state, moral governance demands leaders who guide through example rather than fear. Above political authority stands the mandate of heaven, reminding rulers that power survives only as long as virtue sustains it. And within every ordinary encounter between two human beings, reciprocity asks a question that pierces every illusion of superiority. How would you wish to be treated if the positions were reversed? Finally, righteousness arrives as the ultimate test of character. It appears when comfort conflicts with justice, when silence promises safety, but truth demands courage. At that moment, philosophy ends, choice begins. Confucius knew that societies are not destroyed only by violent revolutions or catastrophic disasters. They are often eroded slowly through the quiet disappearance of character. Respect fades, language becomes dishonest. Ambition replaces responsibility. Individuals pursue advantage while ignoring the fragile web of relationships that sustains communal life. Civilization weakens not because people lack intelligence, but because they abandon moral discipline. His philosophy therefore leaves us with an unsettling responsibility. The stability of society cannot be outsourced to leaders alone. It cannot be secured permanently through institutions. Each generation must rebuild the moral foundation of civilization within itself. Every person participates in this task. Each act of patience strengthens the fabric of trust. Each honest word protects the integrity of language. Each moment of courage preserves the possibility of justice. Confucius did not promise that this path would be easy. Self-cultivation demands vigilance across an entire lifetime. The mind constantly negotiates with fear, pride, and desire. Moral clarity must be renewed again and again through reflection and discipline. But he also believed something equally powerful. When even a small number of individuals commit themselves to this path, the atmosphere of society begins to change. Integrity becomes visible. Trust slowly returns. Human relationships regain dignity. The legacy of Confucius, therefore, is not a rigid doctrine preserved in ancient texts. It is a living challenge addressed to every generation. A challenge that forces each person to confront the same fundamental question he asked more than 2,000 years ago. What does it truly mean to become a human being?